I counted the days again and again. I could not stop smiling that whole week. For the first time in many months, my parents made a promise to me. They said, "This Sunday we will go to the zoo together." My name is Lily. I was 11 years old then. I lived with my parents in a small apartment near the city centre. My father worked at a computer company. My mother worked at a hospital. They were good people, but they were always busy. Most nights I ate dinner alone first. Sometimes my father came home after I was already asleep. Sometimes my mother answered work messages while eating dinner. I understood they worked hard for our family, but deep inside, I still missed them. One Friday evening, something different happened. My father came home earlier than usual. He looked tired, but he smiled when he saw me sitting at the table with my homework. "Lily," he said while taking off his coat, "do you still like animals?" I laughed immediately. "Of course, I love animals." My mother walked into the kitchen with 2 cups of tea. She looked at me and smiled softly. "Then let's go to the zoo this Sunday," she said. I froze for 1 second because I could not believe it. "Really?" I asked. "Really," my father answered. "The whole day, just us." My heart felt warm so quickly that I almost wanted to cry. I ran to my room and pulled out my old animal notebook. It was full of little drawings. Some were messy, but I loved them all. Tigers, penguins, elephants, giraffes. I made a new page and wrote, "Animals I want to see on Sunday. Panda lion, red panda, baby monkey penguins." I even drew small stars beside the panda because it was my favorite animal. That night, I could not focus on anything else. While brushing my teeth, I imagined feeding giraffes. While taking a shower, I imagined hearing birds sing in the zoo. Before sleeping, I searched online for funny panda photos and laughed quietly under my blanket. The next morning at school, I could not stop talking about Sunday. "My parents are taking me to the zoo," I told my best friend Emma during lunch. "That sounds fun," she said. "I love the monkeys there." I smiled proudly. "We will stay there all day." Emma looked surprised. "Wow, your parents must finally have free time." Her words stayed in my mind for a moment. Finally have free time. I knew she did not mean anything bad, but she was right. My parents almost never had free time. We rarely went anywhere together. Sometimes we watched movies at home. But even then, my father often checked emails on his phone. Still, this time felt different. This time felt important. On Saturday evening, I prepared everything carefully. I packed tissues, water, snacks, and my small camera into my backpack. I placed my yellow sweater on the chair beside my bed because the weather report said Sunday might be cool in the morning. Before sleeping, I walked quietly into the living room. My parents were both working on their laptops. "Don't sleep too late," my mother said gently. "We need energy for tomorrow," my father added with a smile. Tomorrow. That word filled my whole heart. I returned to my room and placed my backpack beside the door. Then I climbed into bed and hugged my stuffed bear tightly. For the first time in a very long time, I did not feel lonely before sleeping. I closed my eyes with a smile. Sunday was finally coming. I woke up before the sun came up. For 1 second, I did not understand why I felt so excited. Then I remembered. The zoo. I jumped out of bed so fast that my stuffed bear fell onto the floor. I quickly picked it up and laughed quietly to myself. "Today is the day," I whispered. The apartment was still dark and silent. My parents were sleeping, but I could not sleep anymore. I washed my face, brushed my hair, and wore my favorite yellow sweater with a little bear on the front. Then I looked at myself in the mirror and smiled. I looked happy. I walked into the kitchen and prepared breakfast as quietly as possible. I toasted bread, poured milk into 3 cups, and placed everything neatly on the table. I wanted my parents to wake up and feel surprised. At around 7 o'clock, my mother finally walked out of her room. She looked tired, but when she saw the table, she smiled. "You woke up early," she said. "I couldn't sleep," I answered honestly. She touched my hair gently. "You really want to go, huh?" "I've waited all week." A few minutes later, my father joined us. He still looked sleepy. He sat down, took 1 bite of toast, and suddenly his phone rang. The sound felt sharp in the quiet kitchen. He looked at the screen, and his smile disappeared a little. "It's work," he said softly. My mother sighed quietly. "It will only take a minute," my father told me before answering the call. I nodded quickly. "That's okay." At first, I really believed it was okay. I ate my breakfast while my father spoke in a serious voice near the window. I could not hear every word, but I heard things like problem, meeting, and urgent. The call lasted much longer than 1 minute. My mother also started checking messages on her phone. Her fingers moved quickly across the screen. The happy feeling inside me became smaller and smaller. Still, I tried to stay cheerful. "It's okay," I told myself again. Maybe adults just needed to finish a few things first. After breakfast, I put on my shoes and stood beside the door with my backpack. I waited. 10 minutes passed, then 20, then almost an hour. My father finally ended the call. He rubbed his face with both hands. My mother looked down at the floor quietly. The room suddenly felt strange. Too quiet, too heavy. My father walked toward me slowly. "Lily," he began. I already understood before he finished speaking. "I'm sorry," he said softly. "Something happened at work. We can't go today." My mother stepped closer. "We really tried." I held the straps of my backpack tightly. "Oh," I said. That was the only word that came out. Inside my chest, something painful slowly spread. I wanted to cry. I wanted to ask why work was always more important. I wanted to shout, "You promised!" But when I looked at their tired faces, the words stayed inside me. So I forced a small smile. "It's okay," I whispered. My mother hugged me quickly before rushing back to her room to get ready for work. My father touched my shoulder gently. "We'll go another time," he said. Another time. I heard those words before. Soon the front door closed behind them, and then everything became silent again. I stood alone in the living room, with my backpack still on my shoulders. The zoo ticket website was still open on the family computer. The yellow morning sunlight entered through the window, but the apartment no longer felt warm. Slowly, I sat down near the door. I looked at my backpack. Then I quietly took out the animal list I made 2 nights before. The stars beside the panda suddenly made my eyes fill with tears. This time I could not stop them anymore. I cried quietly for a long time. At first I tried to stop the tears, but they kept coming. I sat near the door with my backpack beside me and hugged my knees tightly. The apartment felt too empty. I looked at the clock again and again. In my mind, I imagined other children arriving at the zoo with their families. Maybe they were buying tickets now. Maybe they were already taking photos beside the giraffes. I felt jealous. Then I felt guilty for being jealous. My parents worked hard every day. I knew that. But even so, my heart still hurt. After some time, I stood up slowly and walked to the window. Outside, the city was full of life. Families crossed the street together. Children held balloons and snacks. A little boy sat on his father's shoulders and laughed loudly. I pressed my forehead against the cool glass. I really wanted today to be special, I whispered. Just then, someone knocked softly on the door. I quickly wiped my eyes and opened it. It was Mrs. Green, my elderly neighbor from downstairs. She lived alone with a small white cat named Snowball. Mrs. Green always smelled like flowers and tea leaves. She smiled at everyone in the building. This morning, she looked at me carefully. "Oh dear," she said gently. "Why does my little neighbor look so sad today?" I tried to smile. "I'm okay," but my voice sounded weak. Mrs. Green tilted her head a little. Your eyes are telling me a different story." That almost made me cry again. She noticed my backpack near the door. "Were you going somewhere?" she asked. "The zoo," I answered quietly. "My parents promised, but they had to work." Mrs. Green became silent for a moment. Then she gave me a warm smile. "Well," she said softly, "maybe today can still become a good day." I looked at her with surprise. 20 minutes later, we were walking together to a small park near our apartment. The sky was bright blue, and the air smelled fresh after last night's rain. I walked beside Mrs. Green while she carried a small paper bag in her hands. "What's inside?" I asked. She smiled mysteriously. "Animal snacks." When we entered the park, I realized she meant bird food. Mrs. Green handed me a few seeds, and soon tiny birds hopped toward us across the grass. I laughed softly when one bird came very close to my shoes. "See," Mrs. Green said, "a zoo visitor." For the first time that morning, my chest felt lighter. We sat on a bench and watched squirrels run between the trees. Mrs. Green pointed at them dramatically, like a tour guide. "And here," she said proudly, "we see the famous park squirrel. Very fast, very dangerous." I laughed loudly this time. "Dangerous," I repeated. "Oh yes," she whispered, "especially near sandwiches." I could not stop smiling. Later, we bought ice cream from a small street cart near the park entrance. Mine melted too quickly, and some chocolate ice cream fell onto my hand. Mrs. Green handed me a napkin. "You know," she said gently, "when I was young, I thought happiness only came from big things." I looked at her quietly. But small moments can save a person too. The wind moved softly through the trees above us. I thought about her words while watching birds fly across the sky. Maybe she was right. Maybe this day was not the day I planned. Maybe it was not the zoo. But little by little, the sadness inside me no longer felt so heavy. That evening, the apartment became quiet again. After spending the afternoon with Mrs. Green, I felt much calmer, but deep inside, a small sadness still remained. I kept thinking about the zoo, the backpack near the door, and the way my father said, "We can't go today." When I returned home, I placed my backpack back into my room. I did not unpack it. Part of me still hoped the trip would happen soon. I made instant noodles for dinner and sat alone at the table. The apartment lights felt cold without my parents there. Usually I watched videos while eating alone, but that night I did not turn anything on. I just listened to the silence. Around 10 o'clock, I changed into my pajamas and climbed into bed. I tried reading my animal book, but I could not focus. Outside my window, rain started falling softly. I must have fallen asleep for a little while, because suddenly I heard the front door open. My parents were finally home. I looked at the clock. 11:47 p.m. I stayed still under my blanket when I heard their tired footsteps in the living room. Then my mother spoke quietly. "She waited by the door for so long this morning." Her voice sounded painful. "I know," my father answered softly. There was a long silence. Then I heard something unexpected. "I feel like I failed her," my father said. I froze. I had never heard my father speak like that before. Another silence filled the room. Then my mother sniffed quietly. At first I thought she had a cold, but then I realized she was crying. "We keep saying another time," she whispered, "but another time never comes." My chest tightened. "I hate this," my father said. "I hate missing everything." The rain outside became heavier. I slowly sat up in bed and listened carefully. "She is growing up so fast," my mother continued. "One day she will stop asking us to spend time with her." Nobody spoke for a few seconds. Then my father said something very softly. "I'm scared that day is already coming." My eyes suddenly filled with tears again, but this time the feeling was different. All day, I only thought about my own disappointment. I only thought about my broken promise and my sadness. I never stopped to imagine how my parents felt. In my mind, adults were always strong. Adults always had answers. But now, through the thin apartment walls, they sounded tired and afraid. Just like me. I slowly lay back down under my blanket. For the first time, I understood something important. My parents were not choosing work because they loved work more than me. They were trying to protect our life. The rent, the bills, food, school, things I never needed to worry about. And maybe that pressure was heavier than I understood. The next morning, sunlight entered softly through my curtains. When I walked into the kitchen, my parents were already awake. They both looked tired. My mother held a cup of coffee with both hands. My father looked nervous when he saw me. "Lily," he began quietly, "about yesterday." "I know," I interrupted softly. They both looked surprised. For a moment nobody spoke. Then my mother walked toward me slowly. "I'm so sorry," she whispered again. This time I did not force a smile. Instead, I stepped closer and hugged her tightly. A second later, my father joined the hug too. And suddenly, standing there in the small kitchen, we all laughed a little because the hug felt awkward and crowded. But warm, very warm. That morning, we ate simple toast and eggs together before work and school. Nothing special, no zoo, no big adventure. 1 week later, my father came into my room on Saturday evening and knocked softly on the door. "Are you busy?" he asked. I looked up from my homework. "Not really." He smiled a little nervously and sat beside my desk. "I checked my work schedule 3 times today," he said. "And your mother already turned off her work phone for tomorrow." I blinked. "Why?" My father laughed quietly. "Because tomorrow belongs to you." For 1 second, I simply stared at him. Then my heart jumped so fast that I almost knocked my pencil onto the floor. "Really?" I asked carefully. "Really," he answered. This time his voice sounded certain. The next morning, I still woke up early, but things felt different now. I was excited, but not in the same desperate way as before. I no longer needed a perfect day. I only wanted us to be together. At breakfast, my mother flipped pancakes while singing badly on purpose. My father laughed so hard that he almost spilled his coffee. "Please stop," I said while laughing too. "No," my mother said proudly. "This is world-class singing." "It sounds like a sick duck," my father replied. She threw a napkin at him. The kitchen filled with laughter, and suddenly our small apartment did not feel lonely anymore. Around 10 o'clock, we finally left home together. But we did not go to the big famous zoo in the city. Instead, my parents took me to a small animal park near the river. At first, I was surprised. The place was much smaller than the zoo I imagined. There were no giant maps or huge crowds. The entrance sign was old, and some paint had faded away. But when I looked at my parents beside me, I realized something. This time they were fully here. No phones, no work calls, no rushing, just us. Inside the park, we fed goats with small pieces of carrots. One goat tried to eat my father's shirt, and I laughed so loudly that people turned around to look at us. "Why does this goat hate me?" my father asked dramatically. "Maybe because you look delicious," my mother answered. We took funny photos beside sleepy alpacas. We watched ducks swim slowly across the water. My mother bought me strawberry ice cream, even though she said it was too cold for ice cream weather. Later, we sat together near the giraffe area. The giraffes moved slowly under the afternoon sunlight. One of them bent its long neck toward the trees, and I watched quietly while holding my melting ice cream. "It's peaceful here," my mother said softly. I nodded. Then my father looked at me carefully. "Are you still sad about last Sunday?" he asked. I thought about the question for a moment. Part of me still remembered the disappointment, but another part of me remembered Mrs. Green, the birds in the park, and the quiet family breakfast after that difficult night. So I shook my head slowly. I began carefully, "I just missed you both." My parents became very quiet. Then my mother reached for my hand. "We missed you too," she whispered. The three of us sat together in silence for a while. Warm sunlight covered the park. Somewhere nearby, a child laughed loudly. The giraffe stood peacefully against the orange evening sky. And suddenly, I understood something simple but important. The happiest part of this day was never the animals. It was this feeling. My mother's hand in mine. My father sitting beside me. Nobody rushing anywhere.